Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an urban educator for more than 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, an educational consultant, an equity advocate, and the co-host of Inside the Principal's Office. Let's get started. Before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to tell you about a super exciting event that I have coming up, and I would love for you to be in attendance. As I mentioned in the intro to the show, I am the co-host of Inside the Principal's Office, a web series that runs live on the first and third Saturday of each month. During the show, my co-host Michael McWilliams and I bring on other educational leaders and discuss the most pressing issues and topics facing us today. We also have a Facebook group where educators can connect and learn from each other. Well, this summer, we're planning to host an event where we can get together in person. That's right, not another Zoom or a Google Meet, but live. Even better, it's only $35. So join us in Dallas for a networking reception on Friday, July 30th, followed by a day of activities on Saturday, July 31st. Stop by our Twitter page, join us on Facebook, or check out an upcoming episode for more information. I look forward to finally meeting you. This episode is a pause to ponder segment. These bi-weekly sessions will allow me to share with you my personal thoughts and reflections on a wide spectrum of topics as they relate to education. It is my hope that you will be able to take something from these segments and apply it in a meaningful way as you continue to do amazing work. Remember, while we all have different roles, we all have a single job: educating our students. While scrolling through Netflix recently, I rediscovered a film that I had mentally flagged to watch, but ultimately was pushed further down the list as new releases emerged and thus pushed from my radar altogether. However, it seems that the recent attention to the long-standing racial disparities faced by minorities in this country has resulted in a surge of popularity around such films, so I was not completely surprised, albeit pleased, to once again see that it found itself towards the top of the scrolling lists. I am referring to the 2016 documentary 13th. If you are not familiar with this piece, it explores the booming prison system from the 1960s to today, while revealing how the unjust practices of racial inequality in our country have not dissipated, but instead transformed and resulted in a new type of slavery. I'll admit, if you have any investment in this, the film is challenging to watch. Personally, I watched it in 3 takes so that I could spend some time processing what I was receiving. It's one thing to have a belief that has been bolstered by personal experiences, but it is something else entirely when a director so clearly shows how all the pieces fit together. When the revelation that you had hoped was nothing more than a misguided notion founded upon limited understanding is in fact reinforced by fact after fact after fact. Furthermore, it is troublesome when you see how you have been actively playing a role in this system, despite all your efforts to push back. The film ends with Brian Stevenson, an American lawyer, social justice activist, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and a law professor at the New York University School of Law, calmly delivering a jarring reality. He concludes with, quote, "People always say I don't understand how people could have tolerated slavery. How could they have made peace with that? How could people have gone to a lynching and participated in that? How did people make sense of the segregation, this white and colored only drinking? That's just all so crazy. If I was living at that time, I would have never tolerated anything like that. And the truth is, we are living at this time and we are tolerating it. End quote. We are tolerating it. And it was at that point that I knew I was going to record this session. You see, something earlier in the film caught my attention. It was the food service provider used by a majority of the prison systems in America. It just so happens that the same food service provider feeds a majority of the students in the Chicago public schools, including my own students. A food service provider that has been consistently blasted by consumers for low quality and questionable nutritional standards. I'm talking, of course, about Aramark. Now, don't get me wrong, Aramark also provides food for other venues, such as a majority of our entertainment sections as well, but still. My point is that my school is supporting an organization that has actively contributed to the meteoric rise in prison populations, a population that often grows due to the funnels of our school systems. And it was this that caused me to reflect on the school to prison pipeline, as well as my own experiences and practices in schools. Allow me to share with you some startling statistics. Despite composing less than 25% of the public school population, nearly half of Black students will be suspended at least once during their time in school. Nearly half of all preschool students suspended are Black, though they represent just 18% of total preschool enrollment. Black students comprise nearly a third of all school-related arrests. With the exception of Asian and Latinx students, research shows that more than 1 out of 4 boys of color with disabilities and nearly 1 in 5 girls of color with disabilities receives an out-of-school suspension. One study even found that the disparity is greatest among non-serious offenses, like cell phone use or violations of dress code, or even subjectively defined offenses like being disruptive or displaying affection. Black students in these categories were suspended at rates that are more than double than those for their white counterparts. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Charles, you've only mentioned Black students in these statistics. Surely there are other minority populations that are experiencing similar issues in schools. And yes, you're absolutely right, they are. The disproportionate trends in which minority students are disciplined compared to their white counterparts is disturbing. However, for the sake of this episode, I wanted to focus on our Black populations because of the connection between what we are seeing in schools and the reality in our prisons. You see, while Black people are just about 13% of the U.S. total population, they comprise the greatest percentage of people in prisons and in jails at around 40%. Latinx individuals are also overrepresented in prisons and jails, but by far less. While they comprise 16% of the U.S. population, they represent about 19% of those in prisons and in jails. What I will dive into next will impact both populations, and it is my hope that through reflection, we will be able to implement practices that lower these disparities in our schools for all of our students. I have spent a majority of my educational career in charter schools. While there are plenty of pros if operated correctly, charter schools, as well as district schools, can and do contribute greatly to the statistics that I mentioned earlier. When I first became a principal, we had at our school a rule that all students needed to maintain a, quote, natural hair color. I knew of the rule prior to my move to administration, but to be honest, I never really paid any attention to it. However, when I moved into my office, I found a trifold board that displayed loops of hair in various colors. It seemed like something that would be found in a salon, where a client could point out a desired hair color. Unfortunately, this board was used to compare students' hair color and to determine whether or not they were permitted to stay in the building. I recalled folding it up and putting it away, despite the board's urging that we monitor the color of our students' hair. Shortly after, I discovered a student in the dean's office. When I inquired about the offense, I was told that the student was wearing the wrong color socks. Our dress code clearly stated that black or white solid socks were required, but this student had on a pair of bright neon orange socks. Now, mind you, only a sliver was visible considering that he was wearing pants, but apparently his vigilant teacher noticed and thought it would be better for him to visit the dean's office as opposed to remaining in class. I immediately sent the student back and eventually butted heads with the board. How could we argue that we were in the business of educating disenfranchised populations while simultaneously implementing practices that consistently prevented students from accessing an education? How could we pride ourselves on rewarding compliance with education? Let's just say that I didn't spend a lot of time in that position with that board. Since then, I've been trying to dismantle practices within my schools that contribute to the unnecessarily high percentage of Black students being suspended. In fact, my current school is composed solely of Black students. That means any student who is suspended is added to those statistics. I often tell the story of how my current school was slated to shut down when I initially assumed the role of principal. During this tale, I share how we examined our school culture and found that staff and students alike did not like being in the school. And thus, we set out to make some improvements by focusing on SEL and adopting a restorative approach to discipline. The end, we saw some massive shifts in our data. In fact, from the 18-19 school year up to the point of the pandemic, our office referrals dropped on average by more than 50%. While this was great, we were still averaging more than one office referral per student in the entire school, so of course we still have some work to do. Additionally, during that same time period, our detentions dropped by more than 60%, our in-school suspensions dropped by more than 10%, and our out-of-school suspensions dropped by more than 70%. I feel that I need to include a disclaimer that our system identifies the temporary removal from classrooms, even for restorative justice practices, as in-school suspensions. It was shameful to realize that so many students were facing such harsh consequences for such trivial infractions, such as dress code violations, not having a belt or even the wrong color of shoes, or things like defiance, not standing in line or talking back. It was even more shameful to reflect on those students who already passed through our school prior to these reforms, some of whom I heard have already had legal issues. I couldn't also help but reflect on the vast differences between the schools where I was an administrator and the schools where my daughters went to school. The populations were drastically different, and it seemed that the overall expectations, as suggested by school policies, were just as different. Whereas our schools, even at the middle school level, required students to move through the building in lines, my daughters were permitted to move unfettered through the school to their various destinations. Whereas our schools, again, even at the middle school level, had designated seating areas and required students to remain seated in the cafeteria until they were dismissed, my daughter's school allowed them the freedom to sit wherever they wanted and to relocate whenever they chose. Whereas our schools have strictly defined dress codes addressing nearly every artifact of clothing that you can wear to school, My daughter's school had guidelines which were often disregarded. And despite all of this, my daughters would often share the stories of incidents within their schools that rarely, if ever, made their way to public knowledge. The reality is that these restrictive policies do little to make schools safer, but contribute greatly to preparing students for a system of compliance and uniformity, one that eerily resembled the prison scenes that were shared throughout 13th. So I need to ask, what are you doing to support all of the students in your school? What are you doing to actively push back against the school to prison pipeline? What are you doing to dismantle the policies that support modern day slavery? Or are you living in this time and simply tolerating it? Until next time. I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please be sure to like, subscribe, and of course, share it with friends and family. I'd also love to hear your thoughts about the show, so please leave a comment or two as well. Now, I'm not sure what platform you're using, but the show can be found on Anchor, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and plenty of other platforms. If the show isn't on your preferred site, let me know, and I'll be sure to get it up and running. This podcast is also featured on schoolrubric.com, where you can find educational articles, videos, and interviews with educators from around the globe. Be sure to connect with me and other listeners by following the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and joining the show's Facebook group. Take care.